Okay, perfect. I just set up the live stream and I'm gonna go ahead and start the recording, Derek. I know we have a little bit of a smaller group today, but like I said, we'll have everything recorded and everything. So if you're looking for feedback specifically from anyone, we can definitely send them this recording, and then hopefully give you some feedback as well in a more small group setting. So for anyone who is not familiar with Derek, Derek is a medical doctor at trained at KCMC, and is currently a Trek Scholar at KCMC University, pursuing his master's degree in epidemiology and applied biostatistics. And has been working with Gemini on several projects over the years. Has been working on some of the trauma registry data, working on some of the PPK, which is going to talk about a little bit today, and some policy brief and psychometric validation. So a whole range of topics and projects that Derek has worked on. So welcome, Derek, and we are excited. I'm going to go ahead and start the recording now, and then I will let you take it away. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Maddie, for that warm introduction. As you previously mentioned, my name is Derek Kimaro, 1L Derek Kimaro. And I'm here to present my master's thesis and possibly my final dissertation presentation titled The Effectiveness of the Brief Negotiation Intervention Across Latent Profiles of Risky Alcohol-Related Behaviors among Trauma Patients at the Northern Zonal Referral Hospital, Tanzania, from 2020 to 2025. Sorry. Yes, these are the list of abbreviations in my current presentation. And a few key definitions. The first one being the definition of alcohol, which is relatively familiar, but according to the World Health Organization, alcohol is defined as ethanol contained in alcohol or alcoholic beverages, which is also a psychoactive and toxic substance that can cause dependence, diseases, injury, and premature mortality. As for alcohol-related harms, this is also defined as health, social, behavioral, injury consequences attributed wholly or partly to alcohol consumption, including road traffic injuries, violence, and long-term disease. The other definition I would also want you to be familiar with is regarding latent class analysis, which will be used in this, or to be a very common theme within this study. It's a finite mixture method that identifies unobserved subgroups from similarities in multivariable responses and estimate each participant's probability of a specific class membership. Lastly, I would like you to be familiar with the PPKY, since that's the trial that I'll actually be talking about or referencing in my study, which is Punguza Pombe kwa Afya Yako, Reduce Alcohol for Your Health. This is a culturally adapted, nurse-delivered brief negotiation intervention evaluated in PRAGT, or Pragmatic Randomized Clinical Trial. And in this analysis, all three PPKY conditions will be pooled and compared with usual care. So, starting with the global burden, it's estimated that around 2.6 million deaths in 2019 were attributed due to alcohol consumption, with adults aged 20 to 39 years being most affected. When we zoom down to Africa, the burden is even more significant, where it's actually estimated that we have a very high alcohol-attributed mortality, such that it's estimated around 52.2 deaths per 100,000 people can be actually attributed to alcohol consumption. And when we move even further down into Tanzania, according to the Tanzania Step Survey of 2023, we can see that it's actually estimated that 19.4% of the Tanzanian population currently consumes alcohol, with 8.4% engaging in heavy episodic drinking. So, when we go down even further at KCMC, a Northern Zonal Referral Hospital located in Kilimanjaro, at the KCMC Emergency Department, we see that it's estimated around 30% of adult injury patients will screen positive for alcohol use or alcohol drinking 6 hours prior to their injury. And this has been associated with an increased risk of injury of around 5.71%. Even further, studies actually identified that harmful or hazardous alcohol use was reported among 37% of all injured patients and 20% of non-injured patients presenting at the KCMC, identifying a very significant alcohol use burden, especially for the emergency care department. Alcohol-related harms extend far beyond consumption to things like drunk driving, impulsive acts, fighting, accidents, legal problems, which occur in a very unique and distinct combination across different patients, which may vary significantly from their actual consumption. And trauma studies done throughout the world, or mostly in the US, actually identified or found that intervention outcomes varied across these behavioral profiles, suggesting that these patterns of risky behaviors previously identified, such as drunk driving and impulsive acts, may actually influence recovery after a brief alcohol intervention. So, measures like audit scores, drinking days, drinking amount, usually describe alcohol severity based on consumption, but do not adequately capture how risky behaviors cluster or are present inside individuals. And despite the fact that these behaviors are the ones that directly increase the risk of injury and not the consumption itself. So, latent class analysis will be used in this analysis to identify unobserved subgroups of shared response patterns and capture core occurring behaviors rather than examining each individual behavior separately. So, previous studies, especially one conducted in Moshi, same region as this clinical trial, in this latent class analysis, it's predominantly identified three distinct classes. The first one being the limited risk, the primarily foolish, and pervasive profiles. And in this pervasive subgroup, they also seem to have a higher or heavier alcohol consumption and more frequent alcohol use. And it was mostly a class that was predominantly consisting of younger males compared to the other identified profiles. So this approach will therefore allow me to, through the use of latent class analysis, to identify behavioral profiles within the PPK or the PrAC trial and their relationship with the alcohol outcomes in response to the PPKY intervention. So to address this burden or the alcohol problem in globally, the World Health Organization actually promoted the SAFER initiative, which is a list of 5 cost-effective measures. And the one we're mostly going to focus about today is the facilitation of screening and brief interventions as one of the cost-effective measures to help address this alcohol burden. Even further, the United Nations actually incorporated alcohol addressments through the SDG 3, which is through the strengthening and prevention and treatment of harmful alcohol use and having the global death and injuries resulting from road traffic injuries, which can also be directly attributed to a certain degree to harmful alcohol use. In Tanzania specifically, there have been alcohol-related laws and initiatives, but serious gaps still remain in the policy coordination, enforcement, and resource allocation in order to actually facilitate these initiatives to help address this burden. And when we move down to KCMC, we have a PPKY, which is a culturally adapted nurse-delivered brief intervention, which has shown to be feasible in the emergency care department. And in a recent publication, which focused on the stage 1 analysis, we see that PPKY plus booster arms achieved a 1.2-day greater reduction in binge drinking days at 3 months compared to usual care. So, despite this recognized burden, it still remains unknown whether the PrAC participants or participants in this trial experience these distinct patterns of risky alcohol risk behaviors. And yes, I do acknowledge that previous studies in Moshi did use or identify these patterns, but they used a mixed community and injury sample of lifetime drinkers, and they managed to identify 3 distinct profiles. But these cannot be assumed to extend to the present PrAC participants due to the key difference in the study populations. Therefore, this study identified and characterized latent profiles within the trial and tested whether the PPKY effects differed across them for all the alcohol measures. These include binge drinking days, and drinking amount. So, Evidence from this study will help guide future research and scale-up strategies by identifying risky alcohol-related profiles and how they influence the response to brief intervention, specifically the PPKY. And it will also guide researchers and healthcare providers on potential factors associated with these risky behaviors in the at-risk alcohol using population in Tanzania. So this is a conceptual framework guiding my analysis. As we can see, we have the randomized study trial or the trial participants and the 3 months follow-up, and we're uniquely positioning these latent behavioral profiles as potential effect modifiers on the effect of the intervention itself. And these latent profiles will be identified through the use of 10 baseline drink indicators based on the drinking inventory of consequences. And it is assumed that it can be fairly assumed that these behaviors are indirectly or directly influenced by participants' social demographics, their alcohol use, mental health, and other injury-related characteristics. So this is an overall picture of how my analysis or this study will look at the variables. So the main objective for my study, or the broad objective, will be to classify latent profiles of risky alcohol-related behaviors and assess whether the 3 months effectiveness of the PPKY differs across these profiles among adult trauma patients at the Northern Zonal Referral Hospital in Tanzania from 2020 to 2025. My first specific objective will be to identify these latent profiles of risky alcohol-related behaviors among adult trauma patients. Then, my second objective will be to characterize these classified latent profiles according to demographics, alcohol use, mental health, and injury-related characteristics, which will be encompassed under baseline characteristics among the adult trauma patients in this trial. Lastly, I will assess whether the effects of the PPKY on the alcohol outcomes at 3 months differ across the identified latent profiles among adult trauma patients. So this is my methodology. To give you a brief understanding regarding my parent study, I'm referring to the pragmatic randomized clinical trial conducted from 2020 to 2025. And this enrolled participants are adult injured patients aged 18 and above, presenting at the KCMC emergency department within 24 hours of injury with an alcohol-related risk, which was assessed either through self-report, an audit score greater or equal to 8, or a positive breathalyzer score. And this study was conducted at the KCMC emergency department and had two major arms. And the overall aim of this study was to assess the effectiveness of this intervention. And the trial arms included, or as previously described, include the usual care, which was a control arm, the PPKY, or the intervention, the PPKY plus booster SMSs. A brief description of the intervention itself. This was a culturally adapted, nurse-delivered 15 one-on-one brief and negotiation intervention delivered using motivational interviewing and supported by booster messages throughout the follow-up. So for my current analysis, this will be a secondary analysis of this data where I actually obtained ethical clearance from the KCMC University Research Ethics Committee. And my approach will be an intention to treat analysis. And the inclusion criteria for my analysis will be all the participants in the current data set with 3 months follow-up data. And I will also exclude participants with no arm allocations in the parent trial. As we can see here, this is a flowchart demonstrating the participants where I started with a number of 674 participants, which will be included in the primary latent class analysis and the ones that will be followed up. We see that one participant was excluded due to no arm allocation, so that we could not actually assess the effectiveness on this individual. But after obtaining the two-class solution, these participants were followed up until 3 months, where I had a sample of 543 and 131 were lost to follow-up. So the complete participants were 500, who had completed outcomes at baseline and 3 months were 508, and those who had incomplete outcomes were also imputed so that they can all be incorporated, forming a final sample 543 for the outcome analysis. So for my methodology, regarding it's been structured based on the objectives of my study, I'll start using the baseline adult trauma in the PPK trial and baseline alcohol-related behavior indicators. And these indicators are these 10s, which can be illustrated in box number 2. And these are obtained from the driver drink inventory of consequences. And these include behaviors such as drink driving after 3+ drinks, drink driving arrest, greater use of drug following use of alcohol, foolish risks, and so forth. And these were actually originally collected using a response scale ranging from 0 to 3, which is almost always. And using these indicators, I performed the latent class analysis using R version 4.42 and the Poker package and tried to explore between 2 to 6 class solution, where I selected the best or most optimal solution based on BIC, AIC, entropy, class size, and clinical interpretability and relevance. And then these participants were allocated to these classes based on the highest posterior probability and where I would actually obtain the final latent class solution. And these results will be presented in the form of a radar plot. For my second objective, which was to characterize these participants based on the baseline characteristics previously mentioned, the variables I'll actually use to characterize these individuals will be age, education years, marital status, baseline audit score, baseline PHQ-9, and baseline clinical assessed injury severity. So the overall aim of this objective was actually to see the association between these variables, or these characteristics, and class membership. And in this case, I performed a 3-step misclassification adjusted logistic regression, accounting for the possible misclassification of the participants into these latent classes. And these were actually fitted, as you can see here. This is the logistic regression that was actually fitted. And the results will be presented in form of adjusted odds ratio for the pervasive risk behavior versus the low risk with driving-related harm subgroup, which will be the reference group. And lastly, will be to assess whether the 3 months effect of the PPKY on alcohol use differed across these identified latent profiles. So before I proceed, I would like to make you familiar with the three outcomes for my study. The first one being the total binge drinking day. And these were assessed at both baseline and 3 months using the 28-day timeline follow back. And the first one being the total binge drinking days in the past 28 days. The secondary outcome being the total drinking days in the past 28 days. And the total number of standard drinks in the past 28 days, all assessed using the same measure at both baseline and 3 months. And in my data preparation, I performed a bootstrap resampling for the main estimates, and missingness of the outcomes was assessed and addressed through mice and using predictive mean matching in order to preserve the overall structure of the missingness and the patterns in the original data set. And this is a simplified equation of the model specification. And in this case, I did not implement a longitudinal mixed effect model, but instead opted for a baseline adjusted model, and the primary coefficient of interest in my analysis will be the interaction term B3, which looks specifically at the treatment and class interaction term and its significance. Throughout my analysis, I adjusted my predictions based on the baseline outcome for respective outcomes, since I fitted 3 respective models in order to ensure and enhance precision, and also included baseline and audit due to the fact that they were found to be significant predictors for class membership and due to the drastic differences within the classes. So for each specific outcome, I opted for for the most fitting model. The first one being binge drinking, where I fitted a negative binomial type 2 equation, and the effect measure will be the incidence rate, will be presented in the form of incidence rate ratio. For the drinking days, I used the zero inflated negative binomial, and the effect measure will also be the incidence rate ratio. And the last one will be the drinking amount, in which I opted for the 3D model, which was the most optimal fit for all these specific outcomes. And these model choices were guided by the outcome distribution and comparison of candidate and potential candidate models using the AIC, BIC, residuous checks, and overall convergence. And these results will be presented in the form of table with class-specific estimates and a confidence interval of 95%. So starting with the first results for objective 1, we can see that I obtained a 2-class solution where we had 2 two different classes, the first one being the lower risk subclass and the pervasive subclass. We can see that in this radar plot, in the lower risk subclass, they predominantly had very low probabilities of engaging in all the risky behaviors, but the ones that were still uniquely significant or identified in both cases were the presence of or the engagement of drunk driving after 3 drinks, meaning that most participants still engaged in drunk driving irrespective of their risk class. The other mark is also having experienced alcohol-related accidents. These were also predominant characteristics both in the low and high risk class. And we can see that in the pervasive group or the high risk subclass, the most predominant characteristics included the impulsive, regrettable actions and engagement of foolish risks, with other harmful behaviors still being present. And this last column, basically, this represents the absolute difference between the probability of engagement for when compared the low risk to the high risk class. So it's basically just an absolute difference of the probabilities. In my objective two, this was the characterization of the latent class based on the baseline characteristic, where I performed an adjusted misclassification adjusted logistic regression, where we can see that the most significant predictors for being in the higher risk subclass compared to the low risk were age, baseline audit, and PHQ-9, with there being that for every unit increase in age, there was a 5% lower odd of being in the higher risk class, signifying that the higher risk class was most likely involved or included participants of younger age. And as age increases, the odds of them being in the high risk class was significantly lower. The same applies for the audit score in PHQ-9, where you can see that for every unit increase in these scores, there was a 14% increase chance of them being in the high risk class compared to the lower risk. But the other factors, such as education, did not seem to have any significant influence on them on the class allocations themselves, as long as being partnered. And also, I tried to compare whether either class was actually associated with more severe injuries at presentation at the EMD. But in this case, we can see that there was no significant difference, even though the overall direction seems to suggest that the pervasive subclass may be prone to more severe injuries. Lastly, we'll go to look at the effectiveness across the classified latent classes, and this is my table 1 for the effectiveness analysis. We can see that this is the overall distribution without exclusion of these participants in the overall study. We can see that there was no significant differences in the allocations themselves. And for my first effectiveness outcome, the first outcome I'll be looking at is the binge drinking, which used the negative binomial. We can see that for the first coefficient, which looks at the lower risk with driving related harm, which looked at the PPK versus usual care within the lower risk subclass, we see that there was no significant, or there was no significant effect within the subclass itself, and the p-value was not significant itself. But when you look at the pervasive subclass, we see that there was a marginally higher or more significant effect when comparing high-risk individuals in the usual care compared to those with PPKY, with it being lower than with the actual value being 0.23, signifying that the individuals in the PPKY had a lower incidence rate of binge drinking compared to those in the usual care. And when we look at the arm and class interaction, we can see that it was actually statistically significant, showing that in the case of binge drinking, the pervasive class actually significantly benefited compared to the lower risk class. For my second outcome, I'll be looking at the drinking days. And this utilizes the zero inflated negative binomial. When we look at the class-specific estimates, we see that in the lower risk subclass, it was also not significant, meaning that individuals in the usual care versus PPK, there was no significant difference with regards to the incidence of drinking days. But when you look at the pervasive subgroup, we can see that there was still the retained effect where participants in the PPK intervention actually had a much lower incidence rate of drinking days compared to those in usual care. But when we look at the harm class interaction, this was not statistically significant. And my last outcome will be looking at the drinking amount, in which I will utilize the Tweedy or the compound Poisson gamma distribution. And the effect measure was in mean ratio, meaning this basically gives you the mean drinking amount ratio when comparing usual care versus PPKY. And we can see that in the mean ratio for the lower risk, when we look at the class specific estimates, yes, the direction does still favor the PPKI, but it's indicated that it's not statistically significant. But when we look at the pervasive or higher risk subgroups, we see that in the class-specific estimates, that there was a significant reduction in the mean drinking amount between participants in PPKI compared to those in the usual care, suggesting that in this class, the intervention was effective. But when we look at the arm class interaction, if the difference is not statistically significant. So for my discussion, in this analysis, we uncovered or identified two classes among the trauma patients with alcohol use disorder. And these findings, when compared to a latent class performed in MOSH, which managed to identify three classes among the general population, this difference might be actually explained by the possibility that due to the fact that this trial was actually performed among individuals with more severe or at-risk alcohol consumption, it may have brought more similarities and thus condensed or reduced the heterogeneity that existed in the behaviors between the two subgroups. And secondly, we can see that the solutions also differed from the trauma center studies conducted elsewhere, where they managed to identify 4 to 5 classes were reported, but they used a different indicator measure for the problem for assessing these risky behaviors. And they obtained classes such as the multiple risk, drink driving, fighting and foolish, accident and injury related subgroups. So this is also different compared to our population. So the literature and the study therefore support the idea that risky alcohol-related behaviors cluster in patterns, but it also shows that the exact number of classes purely depends on the population, the indicator or the tool actually being used, and the class selection criteria for the assessment of the intervention itself. Second, we can see that age and alcohol severity findings were also consistent with previous profile studies where more severe profiles were associated with younger age and heavier alcohol use, as it was seen in the study done in Moshi, while drinking quantity, frequency, and age at initiation may have also distinguished classes elsewhere. So findings in this study are relatively similar and actually support prior evidence. The new thing that comes into play is the fact that the PHQ finding adds another mental health dimension, as depressive symptoms were not previously examined in the closest comparable Tanzanian studies and other trauma centers. This adds a new measure and a possible consideration when we are looking at risky alcohol behaviors and the association of mental health disorders. Another point is that in the PPKY, it was associated with a greater reduction in binge, specifically when looking at the class-specific estimates, when we look at binge drinking among participants with pervasive risky behavior. And this is broadly consistent with studies reporting clearer benefits among patients with heavier alcohol use or multiple alcohol-related risk behaviors, although some behavior-specific groups showed little improvement. And this basically just means that even for other studies have actually shown that even though it's a bit surprising that participants with higher risky or more engagement in risky behaviors actually respond better to brief interventions compared to individuals with less risky profiles. And these findings are actually supported in this analysis. The last point is that the direction and significance of class-specific estimate was consistent with potentially stronger reduction in the higher risk classes across all outcomes in the measured study, providing even more evidence for the previous hypothesis. So, for my recommendations, the first one being to the PPKY research team is to investigate why high-risk profiles may consistently benefit through brief interventions across alcohol use outcomes and populations. The other suggestion would be for future research to focus on potentially developing and validating a contextually relevant screening tool for risky alcohol use behaviors to help identify potential profiles in the alcohol using population. Another recommendation for future alcohol profiling research specifically is to include broader mental health measures, as depressive symptoms were strongly associated with risky alcohol-related behaviors, as seen in my findings. And the last one is to healthcare providers and future interventionists is to continue offering PPKY to all eligible adults, patients, and other at-risk alcohol users, as these current findings do not support excluding, prioritizing, or assigning treatment based solely on risky behavior profiles. Instead, consider integrating contextually validated behavioral screening measures, as these patterns may also influence response to brief intervention, as seen in this analysis that risky behaviors might actually indeed play a role. So they should actually be considered in the screening or integration of intervention studies. So the overall strength and limitations of this study, the start one, this is actually the very first Tanzanian study to examine whether risky alcohol-related behavior profiles influence the response to the culturally adapted and contextually relevant brief intervention using robust analytical methods. Secondly, this is also among the first studies to actually identify potential association between depressive symptoms and risky alcohol use related behavior, but I do not imply causality, just merely an association. And lastly, this study generated clinically meaningful and contextually relevant profiles that warrant further investigation among the wider population of alcohol users. Lastly, the limitations. The first one I'd like to account is the fact that we had a relatively small class sample size, which led to a small class specific samples, which led to a production of very wide confidence intervals, limiting the exact precision estimate for the exact class effect size. Even though they were significant, it's relatively hard to know the exact effect size at a specific level. The second one being latent profiles were identified using the drink inventory of consequences, which you had 50 indicators, but this was a self-reported measure and may be subject to recall bias, which may have affected the classification in a bidirectional way, meaning it may have led to subject recalling or under recalling their actual frequency of engagement and behavior, and social desirability, which may have led to underestimation in the severity of them engaging in said behavior. Lastly, the sample predominantly or only included relatively high risk users, meaning audit participants with an audit score of greater or equal to 8, and not the general alcohol using population, which may have limited potential patterns of behaviors from emerging. So I believe that concludes my presentation. So I thank you and welcome you for questions and comments.
Thanks so much, Derek, for going through that presentation. That was incredibly well done. I can just start with kind of just like some general feedback, and then turn it over to the rest of the group, or if you have specific kind of like areas that you would like feedback on or questions, we can also do that. But I just wanted to start with some general like things that I really enjoyed about the presentation. I think even just starting at the beginning, your like list of abbreviations, and then going through some of those like key definitions that you wanted people to already have in mind and know, before you kind of started into the main content was really helpful. And I think a really nice way to just like ground the entire audience, in kind of what you were going to talk about and then things that they should know before you started. I also really enjoyed this slide, that you have up right now of showing kind of like step by step when we think about, the global burden, how it's important in the Africa region specifically, and then why it's also really important in Tanzania, and why this work is really important, and meaningful. And I think just in general, you just did a really nice job of like outlining this larger problem that you kind of set the stage for here in the background, and in kind of your problem statement slides. And then I also think as you wrapped up the presentation, you did a really nice job like coming back to all of this and saying, why this is important work, and what you've added to the literature and the research base around this. And so I think in general, you just did a really nice job there. And then also just in general, I think your presentation was just really nicely organized. It was very easy to follow, and your pace of speaking was also very easy to follow. I felt like I was like with you every step of the way. Yeah, so just a really nice job overall. I think you can tell that you put a lot of time, and thought and effort into this work and into this presentation specifically, for your thesis. So yeah, a really nice job. That's kind of my general feedback that I wanted to go through, but if you have any specific areas of feedback that you would like from the group, um, feel free to ask, or if others, please feel welcome to jump in, and ask any questions for Derek or offer any areas of feedback as well. But really nice job.
Uh, Thank you, Mandy, for the comment, and I take it to heart. So thank you so much. I'll keep on practicing to make it even better. But thank you for this first acknowledgement. And I would like to actually welcome for the questions and feedback. And in case I do come up with something, I'll actually just mention it at the end. So welcome, everyone.
Oh, it looks like Baraka might have a question.
Sure thing.
Okay, thank you, Madeline, for the opportunity. Congratulations, Derek, for such a wonderful presentation. I really enjoy your slides. They are well prepared. I also enjoy your confidence. You seem to know your topic very well. I like the flow and the link of the studies from previous studies and the gap. One issue I think in general you need to consider is the time management. You spend a lot of time in results,
Mm,
so I think you need to find a way to summarize your results so that at least, as in the defense, you are supposed to use a maximum of 20 minutes
mm,
to finish all the presentation. Because I enjoyed the last part of your presentation, but we are a bit rushing because of time. So I think you need to work on your time management. At least you finish within 20 minutes. Coming to your results, what was the criteria of analyzing age as continuous variable, not categorical variable?
mm. What I did actually try out both options, but I thought in this case I did not have a clinically meaningful justification to actually categorize the ages. That's why I opted for a more linear approach so that I did not actually diminish the power of my analysis. So there is no clear category that these participants aged in this age category are more associated. I did not have enough literature to actually support categorization. That's why I opted for a more linear approach. But I did test out both possibilities, and the results were consistently the same. So I don't know if that answers the question
So
to
did you try
mm,
different categories from the previous literature and see if there's a significance
mm,
difference? Because
mm,
at least you find a different way. Because when we want to present this to policymakers with no background of statistics, I think categories matters. Is easier for someone to understand than this. I don't know if you had tried several categories to see if it make more sense.
mm. Okay. I'll actually take that, and I only tried one specific categorization that was in the previous Moshi study, which I didn't think it was mostly clinically justified. But I'll try considering possible options, probably WHO standards or other African standards, to actually see if they actually bring more clinically relevant results. So I'll take that into account and try to incorporate it in the next
This
presentation.
also goes to your other variables of marital status. Why did you
Yes.
decide to have two categories was it presented like that in the in the data set, or you decided to combine options? And if you decided to combine the options, how
Mm.
did you arrive at those two options in the marital status?
Oh, okay. So in the
You
original
had two
study,
options.
actually, hello?
Yes, you had two options in marital status. I
Yes.
hope you did combine some of the options. And why did you combine them?
Actually, I had around four options since being individuals being part, we have individuals who are single, the ones who are cohabiting, the ones who are married, and those who have possibly lost but have lost a partner. So they're relatively single. So in this, the reason why I opted for in grouping them is I tried, due to limitations of the sample, I tried to not to over stratify my sample, and I'd still combine them using considering clinically justified combinations, in that individuals who are single might be assumed to be very closely similar to participants who have lost a partner and currently are living alone, while partners currently cohabiting or reported cohabiting might be actually demonstrate similar characteristics as to those who are actually married. That's the scientific basis or reasoning as to why I opted for a two category solution.
I
So,
think to make the easy follow-up of the reader, at the end of
mm,
the table, you should find like a key of saying that when you see this, I combine the option A and B, so that someone can follow up the combination. Which options did you combine to come up with the partners and non-partners? So that
mm,
is very important at the end of your table to show that for easy follow-up to the reader. Coming to your last table,
my last
can you
table,
go? Yeah,
uh, 1.3.
not this 1.2 if I'm not mistaken. Yeah.
Mhm.
How did you obtain this IRR?
Since I actually fitted this, let me go back here.
Sorry, what was your study design to make the
My,
life easy?
my study design was this was a secondary analysis to assess the effectiveness or of the clinical trial. I did not opt for a longitudinal mixed effect model. Instead, I opted for a baseline
Sorry,
adjusted.
sorry. I mean, what was your study design?
This it's a secondary analysis of a randomized clinical trial. Or maybe I'm not understanding the question correctly.
Okay. It was what?
It's a
What?
secondary analysis.
I'm not
Hello?
in, I'm not talking about the nature of the data, if it was secondary data or primary data. I'm talking about the study design. What actually was your study design?
Mm,
Okay, I think you need to work on that.
maybe I
The
should.
last one, because of time, I think you need to plot a forest plot in your result number 3 and 4 so that we see the direction of your
Mm,
effect size. Because you talk about the wider confidence interval due to
yeah,
that is not a small sample size. I think it was optimal sample size. So I think you need to have a forest plot. I don't know if you understand that. Because we
yeah.
justify that, yes, having a forest plot, it will show us if it was below one, it's very easy to follow. So I think you can add the forest plot to the objective number 3.
Okay. Maybe can I also ask an additional question? Uh,
Yes.
or maybe just a comment. I did consider just including a single table for all the results, maybe trying to combine, but it felt like it might be cluttered. So I'm thinking, would it be just easier to present specifically the arm class interactions and ignore the class specific estimates? Or because I kind of feel like they're also providing scientifically relevant information, considering that there was consistent effectiveness throughout the high risk. But I can consider combining them into a single table, which will mainly focus on the arm interaction term for all the three outcomes and just specify that the effect measures were different for each case. Would that be an optimal way to actually present them?
Yeah, I think
Or,
the best one because you spend a lot of time in result. Combine them, it can make sense. but also having a forest plot, which will be one
Okay.
slide capturing all the tables. It will be more meaningful so that because of time and also easy for someone to follow. I
Perfect.
think that makes sense because you spend a lot of time in result. Okay.
Perfect.
Generally, it's very, very nice. Keep it up the good work.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Marcella, did you have any questions or feedback that you wanted to add as well?
Um, it's just minor things. I think you did a great job as Baraki and Madeline said. It was very easy to follow and understand like the whole presentation. I was thinking about these tables and and I was, but I don't know that now he mentioned about the time, but I was thinking if you could, after present the tables, do a brief summarize. So in a whole, like, I'm not sure how you would manage that, but not necessarily with the tables, but with some graphic maybe, or I don't know, like arrows coming up and down. What was the main, like, what was the overall information that you got from these three tables? I don't know if it makes sense what I'm saying here. Like, present the three tables and then present something that brings them together. I don't know if I'm expressing myself correctly, but that was one thing. And then in the slide or page 16, maybe add some this one, because I think you mentioned I think three most that were higher in the low risk, the drinking, the driving after drinking. And maybe if you can circle or make a highlight in what you're talking about, because I went through all the table until I found the numbers, but you already know the numbers, so you go faster. So maybe if you mark or something with highlight, it would be easier to follow. Um,
Sure
yeah,
thing. I'll include that in. Thank you. And I guess it
yeah,
falls in with Baraka's comments of actually incorporating visuals to actually summarize everything. So
yeah, maybe, yeah,
I'll try experimenting a few possibilities in order to actually summarize my
yeah.
results in visual. Thank you.
No, thank you. It was very good. It was very easy to understand everything, so very good. Thank you.
Sure thing.
Well, thanks, everyone. I know we're coming to the end of time. I'm going to go ahead and stop this recording. Derek, I will send this recording over to you so you can have that. And
Sure thing.
then looking forward to hopefully seeing everyone again next week. And then Derek and Doreen will be presenting their thesis defense projects again on August 4th. So we'll get to hear a little bit more about some of their work and as they practice for their actual master's thesis defenses coming up. But again, great job, Derek. This was a really nice presentation and incredibly well done. And thanks for sharing it with us. But yeah, hope to see you all next week and have a great rest of your morning or afternoon for folks in Tanzania. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you soon.
Thank you.